For today's webinar, we have Nelson Santos, a principal scientist with RTI International, presenting Using Risk Management to Optimize Forensic Laboratory Operations. Without further delay, here is Nelson.
Thank you, Natalie. As Natalie said, my name is Nelson Santos, and I currently work for RTI International in the Center for Forensic Sciences. Before joining RTI, I worked for the Drug Enforcement Administration. In the last 12 years, I was the Deputy Assistant Administrator for the Office of Forensic Sciences, which is responsible for their laboratory system. I bring that up only to mention that back in 2017, when 17025 came out with a new standard, and they included risk management, I began to look into and do a little research on risk management. And in looking into ISO 31000, which is dedicated to risk management, I had that aha moment. I read the definition and I said, aha, I think I understand what this is about. And with that, we began to implement these risk management principles into our decision making and into our management system at DEA. What we found is that it began to optimize the laboratory as a whole, which is the topic of today's discussion, using risk management to optimize forensic laboratory operations. Okay, let's talk about the objectives of the webinar. Learn the meaning and purpose of risk management. We're going to spend some time defining risk management. I mentioned the ISO 31000 standard where I had the aha moment. I will share that with you. Hopefully you will see its simplicity in trying to understand what risk management is about. We'll talk about the why use risk management. We'll understand the value of incorporating risk management into your management system, not only as a program within your management system, but in terms of you using it to manage your laboratory operations. There's a slight distinction there, and we'll make clear what that distinction is here in a bit. And lastly, we'll understand how assessing risk management can improve your part process. So we'll start with a very broad look at it, and then we'll begin to take it down to a level where it becomes applicable to you and gives you something that you can take home to use in your laboratory. I do want to say that risk-based thinking is not rocket science. It's something that we do automatically every day. Every day of our lives, we actually do risk-based thinking. We just don't know that we're doing it. An example would be driving into work. You get in your car, you drive into work, and you get to work at a certain time. In this particular instance, you have an objective, and that objective is to arrive at work at a particular time. Now, there are factors that you should consider in going into work. And the more factors that you consider, the less risk you have in not arriving at work at a certain time. So let's say traffic, for example. If you do not look at your app, let's say your Waze app, and sees where traffic may impact your arrival time, then you are taking on more risk. However, if you do take into account that risk, you're actually gaining information that you didn't have, and you're doing risk-based thinking to allow you to meet that objective of arriving at the same time. So I wanted to start off with that. So sometimes the topic of risk management is a little intimidating, and I wanted to let you know that all we're trying to do is taking it from the passive and bring it into the active, and that's really the goal of risk-based thinking. Okay, let's talk about laboratory operations. And what I'd like to do is begin this with a question. And the reason why I begin with a question is any risk management or risk-based exercise need to define the context and then scope of what we're working in. So the way we're going to do this is by asking a question, and then I'm going to give you folks a few seconds to think about it, and then we're going to discuss that in more detail. And the goal here is to provide a baseline for us to take forward for the rest of the presentation. So I'd like you all to answer this question. What is the core function of a crime lab? Now, there are many things that crime labs do. They testify, they provide assistance in the field, they do a number of different things. But I want you to focus on what the core function of a crime lab is. What this will do, as I said, it'll allow us to set the proper baseline. And if you wouldn't mind, what I'd like you to do is to jot down in the chat what you think the primary function of a crime lab is. And I don't want you to make it very lengthy, just very short and to the point. The idea here is just to get us all thinking the same way in terms of what it is we do. And I'll give you a few seconds to do that, and then we'll continue. Okay, so here is the answer that I have come up with, and I'll explain here in a bit why converting evidence into forensic information is what I chose. Now, one of the things when you think of risk management is you think generally in a manufacturing type role. Historically, manufacturers have used risk management to improve their processes. And what I've done here is I've tried to create a pseudo-manufacturing comparison to what it is that is done in a crime lab. For example, a piece of evidence is submitted to a lab, whether it be a kilo of cocaine or whether it be biological fluid or maybe some packaging that potentially has latents on it. The evidence in and of itself has no intrinsic value. For all intents and purposes, it can be considered a raw material. Now, we in the crime labs, what we do is we analyze that evidence and we derive forensic information. And the true value does not lie in the evidence. It lies in the forensic information that is provided. And then, of course, many stakeholders will utilize that information for intelligence, for judicial purposes, for furthering an investigation, for a number of different things. And that is why it's important for this discussion to take and look at what we do in that kind of pseudo-manufacturing role. It's kind of an elegant way of showing how what we do is just not analyzing evidence. We actually take that evidence and convert it into something which is far more valuable than what it was submitted initially. And the main objective in doing that is for us to provide high-quality lab results and enhance customer satisfaction. Again, when we think of, let's say, a car manufacturer is trying to provide the highest quality that they can in order to enhance customer satisfaction. And it's one of the reasons why they institute risk management or risk-based thinking into their processes. And it's one of the main reasons why I thought it would be important just to kind of make a comparison of how what it is that's done in a crime lab is not that much different than what is done in a manufacturing setting, such as a car manufacturer. So let's continue to talk about laboratory operations. In particular, how do we optimize laboratory operations? And frequently when we think of optimizing something, we talk about how can we make it more efficient. And that's exactly the point that I want to get across here. How can we make the management of your lab more efficient? How can we optimize it? And what you see is an umbrella, and the umbrella has a number of different practices and tools that are available to managers in order to more effectively manage their labs. We have things like change management, organizational alignment, standardization, a number of different tools and practices that are available to us that help us, again, to address the core function of converting that evidence into forensic information. Now, one tool that's not here is risk management. And the reason why risk management is not included initially is that risk management is actually interwoven into all of these various practices and techniques. And I bring this up again in the context of how can we optimize our management of the laboratory. And one way of doing that is by including risk management into your tool chest of practices that you use in order to be more effective at the management of a lab. By being more effective at managing a lab allows you to optimize laboratory operations, and in turn, it converts that evidence into forensic information, not only quicker and faster, but more effectively. So what is risk management? Well, here's the aha moment that I had that I mentioned earlier. And this is from 31,000, 2018. It's the effect of uncertainty on objectives. And it's 5 words. And I read this back in 2017, and I read it today, and it really resonates with me because it kind of makes it clear. And I want to break this down for you just a little bit, unpack it so we can understand it even more clearly. So let's take a look at that word uncertainty. The definition of uncertainty, and this is not the metrological definition, but the definition of uncertainty, the regular definition is a deficiency of information or a lack of certainty, a lack of information essentially. So if we were to just substitute uncertainty with the effect of a lack of information on objectives, it becomes even more clear. So what is the effect of me not having sufficient information on what do I want to accomplish, right? And this is an important aspect of risk management in that what you're doing is you're looking to add information so that you can reduce your risk. Now, the term management is just controlling things, the process of dealing with controlling things. When you put them all together, what you have is risk management is simply a way to control for a lack of information or knowledge. Now, I want to take a second for you to think about that. Risk management is managing essentially a lack of information. And how do you manage a lack of information when you don't know what that information is? Well, you actively think about it. And that's where it's important to think about what it is essentially that you might not know. And there is where risk management becomes an important tool. It sounds a little complex, but what it does is it makes us think about those things that aren't so obvious to us. In other words, the more we know about a design, a plan, a process, a method, the less uncertainty we have, the more likely we are to meet our objectives. Since the word uncertainty is used, it is a neutral construct. It does not refer to negative or positive, actually refers to both. And here's where the value comes in from a management perspective as well, is that we consider both threats and opportunities. The easy example to give to an opportunity is think of strategic planning, and you have a risk-based management thinking approach to strategic planning. And what you find is that you look at the future and you say, what changes technologically may be available to us? What opportunities may be available to us in the future that aren't currently available, that are worth taking a risk trying to do? The thought is that as you begin to gain more information, you take a higher risk, but that opportunity is something that's worth taking. So now that we know the definition of risk management, let's look into why use risk management. When you look at the slide, you see that ISO has a lot of standards that deal with risk management. The first one is ISO 31000, the 2018 version, which is dedicated to risk management principles and guidelines. I encourage everyone to take a look at that standard. It makes a compelling case for the use of risk management in your operations. I highlight the 2009 standard as well, just to make the point that a little over a decade ago is when ISO first published the standard on risk management. Prior to that, they had talked about risk management. It wasn't until a little over a decade ago that they really began to take risk management more seriously and raise its importance in the industries. And the reason why was primarily because all these various industries were using risk management in a slightly different manner. They had their own vocabulary, and they wanted to create some uniformity. So in 2009 was issued ISO Guide 73, created that one vocabulary for risk management. So it was a way for ISO to kind of begin providing uniformity throughout all of the industries with regard to risk management. Now, ISO Guide 9001 is one that's very familiar to us. A lot of the verbiage that's in the quality management system of 9001 is included in 17025. And you can see that the term appears 50 times. Once again, ISO began to emphasize the importance of risk management and risk-based thinking in all aspects and all standards that they were utilizing. Now, ISO 9004 is one that I ran across while doing some research on risk management. And from the title, you can see it's guidance to achieve sustained success. I bring this one up here because it aligns quite nicely with the umbrella example I gave. It's really a guide on best practices in order to sustain success. And the closest analogy I can make is to the Malcolm Baldrige criteria, where there are certain things that organizations need to do in order to achieve excellence. And this guide here provides its own checklist on a variety of activities that organizations should include as part of their management, which one is risk and risk management, in order to have sustained success. So I bring this up there just more for curious purposes. Anyone interested in looking at it, it provides some guidance on how to maintain excellence. Now, ISO 17025 is the one that's near and dear to our heart, and I point to clause 7.7, ensuring the validity of the results. Now, clause 7.7 provides a list of various activities that a lab can take in order to ensure they have valid results. What it really is a risk mitigation list. It's not called that, but that's exactly what it is. Here are certain things that labs can do to ensure that they meet their objective of providing valid results. And again, if you remember back to our example, the primary focus of a lab is to ensure that that forensic information is unimpeachable. So 7.7 is a risk mitigation clause. Now, clause 8, and here is the first time, the 2017 version was the first time that ISO has actually explicitly put it into the standard. 8.5 specifically requires that actions to address risk and opportunities be considered. And that's where the note comes in. There's really no requirement to have formal methods. I would say that it's important to have some sort of formality associated with risk management so that you can actually deal with 8.5.3. And 8.5.3 refers to actions taken to address risk and opportunity shall be proportional to the potential impact on the validity of lab results. And I want you to focus on the word proportional. How do you determine proportionality when you have no formal mechanism to evaluate the magnitude of a particular error or nonconformance or risk or opportunity? So this is why I say that it's important to have some sort of formality associated with your risk-based thinking so that you can evaluate 8.3 and determine how impactful is a particular risk associate that could impact your validity of your laboratory results. So that's why I think it's important to have something in place. And we'll talk a little bit more about simple methods, simple matrices that can be used to address 8.5.3. So we discussed the why in terms of ISO and perspective from ISO. What I'd like to do is shift the perspective to management and leadership. You know, why use risk management from a lab management and leadership perspective? Well, there are a number of reasons. The first one is helps to identify threats and opportunities that are not apparent. We discussed this before, and I think it's important to think about how risk management looks at those areas that you would otherwise not look into. It will look for areas where there is a lack of information. And when we actually actively do that, we begin to discover areas or opportunities or possible threats that aren't that apparent. It creates a culture of continual improvement. Risk management is based on the question, what if? What if this fails? What if this opportunity presents itself? What if we don't do this? So by having that mindset of what if inside of an organization, it creates that culture of continual improvement. As I said earlier, it focuses not only management on objectives, but it focuses entire teams. When you utilize teams to evaluate and assess the level of risk, it makes it easier for them to understand how decisions are made in reaching those objectives, which leads to the next point, which is improved transparency. We will show later on how teams help to evaluate a failure and how that failure informs the decision to take a corrective action. It enhances the CAR/PAR process. We will get into that in greater detail. And it shifts thinking from compliance to the performance. And this is one point that needs to be identified a little bit more stronger, and that is that oftentimes we get into the mode of checking boxes and looking at compliance. Well, with risk management, since it is forward thinking in many ways, it actually changes that into more of a performance, which from a managerial perspective is better for the organization. And lastly, something that we all deal with, and we'll get into an example that will show how this does this, it helps to prioritize limited resources. Since we can actually gauge the level of problems associated with a certain risk, it allows us to then put resources where they're greatest, where the need is the greatest. So it allows us to then rank the importance of a particular risk, and those with the highest risk and the greatest importance on achieving our objectives is where we put the resources. And actually, from just a simple decision-making standpoint, it helps to make better informed decisions. And again, oftentimes decisions are based on the information that you have available to you. And when you think about a decision in the context of what information I do not have available to you, it actually improves the outcome of that decision. So now that we know the definition of risk management and why we use risk management, let's take a look at the strategy that we utilize to evaluate a risk. And it's pretty intuitive. You have 3 stages. You identify the risk first, you assess or evaluate the risk, and then lastly, you control for the risk. So I want to make a note. You notice the arrows pointing in both directions from the assessing. And in many books that you will read, assessing actually includes identification and control. For the purposes of this presentation, we're going to separate the 3 out so that we can talk about each individually. So identifying the risk is done through a variety of different means, and most of these are ones that are in place in most of our labs today. We conduct management reviews, we conduct inspections and audits, performance audits, we use customer complaints, strategic planning. So we have a mix of both retrospective and prospective ways of identifying risk. I want to highlight performance audits because I think it's one of the more useful techniques that can be used in a lab to uncover a problem before it actually occurs. And when you use performance audits with risk matrix tools, such as the one we're going to talk about, FMEA, it allows you to identify where a failure may occur that will impact whatever the objective of that process is. So performance audits, I encourage everyone to incorporate this into your management system. It's a very effective way of dealing with important processes before an issue occurs. Assessing risk is the biggest area here and is where we're going to spend the rest of the afternoon talking about it. And it's usually done using some sort of risk matrix tool. FMEA is the tool that we are going to be talking about. There's other tools. I just found FMEA to be the one to understand very easily and to be as the most effective. Now, root cause analysis is one that's used in our labs and one probably very familiar to all of you. And it actually is a risk assessment tool. The problem with root cause analysis is that there is no magnitude associated with it, and we'll talk about the differences here in a bit. Now, last thing we do is control risk, and we generally do this in our labs through the use of preventative actions or corrective actions. There's other ways of controlling risk, but for the sake of this discussion, we will leave it at that. Now, when we looked at these 2 risk assessment tools, RCA and risk matrix, what are the differences? Well, RCA tends to be retrospective. It's always looking back. A nonconformance is identified, and then a root cause analysis is conducted. That is effective and works very well, and it is actually a way of assessing a risk. The problem is that the risk is not associated with a magnitude. So every risk root cause analysis identifies a problem, but it doesn't say which problem is greater than the other. Now, FMEA, or most risk matrix tools, can look both prospectively and retrospectively. As I just mentioned, Prospectively, it can be used in performance audits and strategic planning. And retrospectively, we will show in the example, it can use in combination with a root cause analysis. And the value of it is actually provides a level of risk associated with that particular identification of a failure or a nonconformance. So here's a basic risk matrix. I wanted to show you this so we can contrast later on with the FME matrix that we will discuss more in depth. But you can see that on the x-axis we have probability or likely of occurrence, and then severity is on the y-axis, and it's color-coded to show easily where something is unacceptable, or in the green, let's say, where it is has an acceptable level. Now, the yellow area is a term that is used in risk management, refers to as low as reasonably possible. We don't utilize that term very frequently, but it is there, and it provides that kind of that gray area between whether you should take action or not. I show this because oftentimes this is sufficient to kind of do a quick evaluation of risk in order to make an informed decision. So now let's talk about the tool that I am going to be mentioning here quite extensively, and that is failure mode and effects analysis. And as the title suggests, it focuses on failures and their effects to understand how each failure can be prevented and their effects reduced. Now, if you recall, in the previous matrix, you had severity and occurrence. Here we're adding a third dimension, which adds a lot of information about how you can mitigate the failure, which in the previous matrix that we mentioned, mitigation or reduction of the effects was not a consideration. This tool is used extensively in the manufacturing industry, and it's one of the reasons why I tried to create a pseudo-manufacturing concept with the raw evidence being converted into forensic information. I think it allows for a better understanding of how how risk management can be used in our industry. Now, it considers three factors: severity, occurrence, and detection. And severity is described as the estimate of the magnitude of harm or damage that could reasonably result from a failure or nonconformance. So we are looking at how that failure impacts our customers or us reaching an objective. And since it can both look at a failure in a process or a nonconformance, it can be both prospective and retrospective. Occurrence is based on the likelihood of the failure or nonconformance occurring. How likely is it that this will happen? Again, it can be looked at retrospectively or prospectively. And detection, which is a third dimension here, is estimating how easily the failure or nonconformance can be detected prior to its occurrence. And here is, I think, where the value really comes in. Do we have a mitigating process in place so that if a very severe failure does occur, that we will be able to detect it? Once again, it's customer and objective focused. Okay, so let's look at this FMEA framework. FMEA framework utilizes what's called a risk priority number, and it's a semi-quantitative determination of the magnitude of risk intended to assist in addressing an area of concern or nonconformance. And the reason why it's semi-quantitative, and you will see, is that when you're setting up your FMEA matrix, it is done somewhat subjectively in setting up the various scales. Also, when you're doing your evaluation of the severity, occurrence, and detection of your failure, that is done by a cross-functional group who is somewhat subjective. So that number that is derived from all of this is semi-quantitative. Now, these scales that I have up here are arbitrary. These can be set up a number of different ways for the purposes of our discussion. Severity is a 1 to 10 scale, occurrence is a 1 to 5 scale, and detection is a 1 to 5 scale. In order to arrive at a risk priority number, we take severity, which we've given more weight, and multiply the addition of occurrence and detection. That is done purposely some FMEA RPNs, you will see that you have severity multiplied by occurrence and multiplied by detection. And a word of caution there, the weight that you would give occurrence and detection is increased significantly, and therefore you might have a lower RPM when in reality the severity is significant. So just something to think about when you're setting up your RPN scale and how you go about getting that score. And as I said, rating is formed by a cross-functional team, and I think that's where it becomes transparent for folks to see what it is that management is doing when they're looking at these things. Here's a sample FMEA matrix. You have severity, occurrence, and probability of detection, all with rankings. Severity, as I indicated earlier, is 1 to 10. The other two are 1 to 5. When setting up the FMEA, it's important to have descriptions, if you use descriptions, that are sufficiently different so that you can discriminate one from the other when evaluating. Let's say, when looking at severity of condition, can you differentiate 5 from 6? You can see that in this example, DEA had 1 to 10. It was determined after some use that 1 to 5 would probably be more effective, but nevertheless, you can set these up any way you'd like. The key is to have that distinction between one and another. For probability of detection, it's important to note that the number 5, the ranking of 5, indicates that the nonconformance would not be uncovered through existing preventative measures. And as you can see, these are color-coded to easily determine what's more severe and what's less severe. So using our 3 variables, as we indicated, we multiply severity times likelihood, which is occurrence plus detection, and we arrive at a risk priority number table. And this is key to evaluating the level of risk. You can see the purples are those that have higher risk and are more serious, where action needs to be taken immediately. And then you have the green scores, which would indicate that the risk is low and action can either be delayed or maybe no action taken at all. And then you have yellow and red in between. The idea of the risk priority numbers, it provides you not only a visual in terms of color, but a numeric value that is semi-quantitative that can be used to determine the magnitude of the risk and the action that should be taken. Okay, let's take a look at an actual case study of a real-life example to get a better understanding of how we can use FMEA. So a scenario is a latent print examiner determines that a print is of no value and does not perform comparison. Subsequent peer review shows that the print is of value and should have been compared to suspect's prints. Just so that we're all on the same page, let me explain that a little bit further. So a latent print examiner receives a case, lifts a print, photographs that print, enhances and photographs that print, and determines that there's insufficient detail to perform a comparison. Subsequent to that, during a normal peer review process, another examiner evaluates the same print and determines that there was sufficient detail and a comparison should have been compared. As a result of that, a car is opened up. An investigation reveals that there's 3 other occasions where latent prints were improperly evaluated over a period of a year by the same examiner. So that same examiner had roughly 3% of his cases that were issued, where reports were issued of no prints of value, where the same error was identified. So the root cause analysis determines that the examiner failed to properly evaluate print due to poor technique. Here's the human error finding, which is never good. So we perform the 5 whys and it reveals possible reasons are training. The initial training the examiner received may have not been sufficient. Technique that's used in photography, or possibly the vision of that examiner may have been somehow compromised. So the corrective action that is undertaken is to retrain the examiner, have another examiner monitor the technique that is being utilized, and actually review the work for 3 months. In this case, no other issues were identified after the retraining and the monitoring and technique. And under normal circumstances, we would close the car. That is why we have the question. Let's take a look how this might be slightly different outcome if we were to apply a risk management principle. So let's examine if risk management would have given us a different result if we evaluated using FMEA. So here we have the same matrix that I showed you before. Below we have the cross-functional team that is doing the evaluation. And you can see that the team has come up with rankings of 7 and 6 for the severity. This is a result of the fact that our objective is to provide forensic information, and since no print of value was the result, there was no information to be provided. The occurrence is in the 2 to 3 range based on the fact that the examiner had less than 3% of the work over a year. And you can see that the determining factor here is the detection. There were no measures in place to prevent that print of no value report going out. So the group as a whole determined and ranked it as a 5, and that gives you that 49 to 48 score. So let's take a look at how those numbers fit into our RPN table here. You can see that the scores 48 and 49 fall right in that area where action should be taken rather immediately. And what this tells us is that although we may have looked at that car as not very serious initially, this tells us right away that it's a pretty serious matter that should be dealt with. Okay, so let's take a look at what we did with the car. Let's re-examine the RPM after the corrective action that was taken. And you can see that the only thing that really changed was the occurrence. The team felt that since there were no more errors found and he was retrained, that the occurrence was lower, but not low enough to give it a 1 since he had a history of this error occurring. And you can see that the RPN is still too high to accept. So now let's take a look at the action that we can take in order to mitigate the risk to a level that's acceptable. The only factor that we can really change is detection. In this particular instance, we institute 100% review for the examiner. And as you can see, the RPN is significantly reduced to a level that's acceptable. And what we've done in this exercise is we've shown that the initial car that was opened in the corrective action that was undertaken, while effective on the surface, after evaluating a little bit more closely with FMEA, was not effective to reduce the risk to an acceptable level. By using FMEA, it's made it quite clear that by adjusting these variables, you can actually obtain a risk level that you are willing to accept in order to meet your objectives. So we've looked at this failure retrospectively, looking backwards, and now what we're going to do is we're going to look at it prospectively, the same failure. And what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at the other examiners who may or may not have found similar problems in their peer reviews. In this particular instance, there was no peer reviews that identified a similar problem. What we have in front of you here is a failure mode and effects analysis worksheet. And what it does, it looks at a certain process, in this particular instance, evaluating the value of latent prints and the possible failures. And that possible failure is improper latent print evaluation. And once again, like we did before, it is scored. And you can see that in this particular instance, the severity is 7, the occurrence is 1. Again, it's 1 because they have not found any similar instances, so it's unlikely to occur. And because we don't have a process in place, the detection is 5, which gives us an RPM of 42, which once again is an unacceptable level of risk for us to meet our objectives. So we institute a recommended action, which in this case is just periodic random reviews. We do that for 3 months, and what we find out is that during that 3-month period, we had no failures identified. We rescore this. Severity stays the same, occurrence stays the same, but now detection is 3. There is a system in place to detect it. There's also an awareness from the examiner that periodically there's going to be a review that's done. So what that does is the likelihood, first of all, of that failure occurring is very low, and then we've increased the detection. The RPN then score is 21, which is now at a level of acceptance. And here is really where we see the value of FMEA. It is prospective, it is looking forward. This would not have been done under a normal RCA, and it would have been difficult to determine what the magnitude of the error was without actually going through the formality of scoring these. So this is why I say that the CAR process, the RCA process, is effective, but it's really retrospective, and it's where the value of FMEA is really in the prospective aspect that I've shown here. So let's summarize what we have hopefully learned today. Risk-based thinking improves decision-making. That hopefully is the key takeaway. Again, risk-based thinking makes us think about a lack of information or a lack of knowledge. And when making a decision, when we actively think about that which we might not know, I think it helps to inform and make a better decision. Controlling risk allows objectives to be met. This is at the core of risk management. As we showed with our example of converting evidence into information, our objective is to provide quote-unquote unimpeachable results or unimpeachable evidence. Well, risk management helps us get there. ISO really likes and emphasizes the use of risk management and risk-based thinking. I anticipate that as 17025 is revised, that it'll be a little bit more aggressive in what it requires with regard to the use of risk management. FMEA is an effective tool to assess and mitigate risk, and it augments the CAR process. Once again, the FMEA tool allows for a determination of magnitude of the risk, and having that available to us just helps to understand the nonconformance a little better. It facilitates the identification of errors before they occur. We talked about the use and process and performance audits. I once again encourage you to use FMEA in those important processes that you have in your lab. Risk management helps to prioritize resources. Once again, since this allows us to identify the magnitude of risk associated with a particular nonconformance or with a particular issue with a process or design, it then helps us put resources where the need is the greatest. And lastly, risk management should be part of your management system, and it really optimizes your lab operations. We look back to the example of the umbrella, and it's just another tool in your tool chest that you can utilize to take your management to the next level. So that's pretty much all I have today, folks. Here are the references that I used in preparation for this webinar. I point to ISO 31000 as we had discussed before. I encourage you to take a look at that. It makes a very compelling case for using risk management. And then if you want to take a really deep dive, reference number 4, Popov et al. Gets into every detail of risk assessment, risk management, and they look at it from a safety perspective. But nevertheless, if you have an interest in looking at that in a little bit more detail, then I encourage you to take a look at reference number 4. So with that, I will end today, and I will be happy to take any questions that you have. This is kind of the motto that I kind of live by here: get stuff done, have fun, and dream big. Thank you very much.
All righty. Thank you, Nelson, for taking that deep dive into risk management. I think you provided us with some really great takeaways. For today's Q&A session, we have guest moderator John Grassel from RTI International joining us. Take it away, John and Nelson.
Well, thank you again, Nelson. That was an excellent presentation, and we already have some questions lined up in the chat, and if the audience has more, please feel free to send those as well, but we'll jump right in, Nelson. First question: since risk is both adversity and opportunity, is it better to ask about adversity and opportunity rather than risk and opportunity?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. The terms risk, threat, adversity, they kind of use interchangeably. And if you read into these books of risk management, they sometimes use threats to identify a risk, and they're kind of used interchangeably. I do like the idea of adversity and opportunity. So that's something that can easily be utilized, but there is a lot of overlapping of terms like threat, risk, and things of that nature. But yeah, I see no problem in using adversity instead of risk.
Great, thank you. Our next question, how do you define the qualitative terms in the risk matrix, low, medium, etc.? Different people may define these terms differently. And then do you publish definitions for the analysis team?
So that's where the work really comes in. There is some guidance that's provided in some risk management books about how you can qualify the various levels of risk. And it is a team effort, which is reason why it's somewhat qualitative instead of purely quantitative. And it's the reason why I mentioned the RPM score has some subjectivity into it, because developing that risk matrix is the most difficult part, right? You could use also probabilities, or even in some instances, 1 failure in 10 or 1 failure in 100. You can do that. There's a lot of leeway. There's no standard way of doing it. There are some, like I said, there is some guidance that's available. You can search FMEA RPM matrices and it'll give you some guidance, but there's no strict rules on how you do it. The only important part is that there's sufficient distinction between one ranking and the next. And that's what we kind of learned, is that 1 to 10 didn't give us that.
Right. And going back to what you said about the aha moment that you had, did you feel that it was a steep learning curve, Nelson?
It was. And in 2017, we hadn't really heard this term. I hadn't heard of this term in terms of the context of forensic science. And seeing it there for the first time was a little intimidating. But I think that ISO did an excellent job of using those 5 words to define risk. And, how does this affect me meeting my objective? And once you just wrap your head around that, I think the rest comes rather easily in terms of understanding what the objective of managing a lack of information is.
Great. Next question from the audience. Can you use probabilities or numbers instead of descriptions when developing your FMEA matrix?
Yeah, and that's what I mentioned just a second ago, the likelihood for that's occurrence and detection. There's ways of doing it with numbers as well. Again, it's somewhat arbitrary, but as long as you have your severity descriptions clear enough, then your likelihood descriptions for detection and occurrence could be used in numbers. Likely to detect it 1 in 10 times or 1 in 100 times, likely to occur 1 in 10 times. Those things can be done. Again, the best way to do this is to kind of utilize it and see which numbers fit into your operation the best.
So on the same track of the FMEA, could that also be used to assess risk in all lab processes?
It is. It's a little cumbersome, right? I would say that you use the FMEA process on those most important processes, or you can incorporate it into all your nonconformances and do a quick RPN score and determine the level of risk. What I would suggest is using that simple risk matrix, basic risk matrix that I provided, which just has severity and occurrence, and it gives you a quick idea, hey, this is a high risk or a low risk issue. So the answer is no, I wouldn't do it on every occasion, every process.
Another question from the audience, and I know you touched on this, but it's probably worth highlighting. Do you recommend including risk management in lab policies and SOPs?
I do. I think it's helpful for staff to see that management is serious about risk management and codifying it in some way. You saying that it's going to be used to evaluate nonconformances and in process improvements and stuff like that. I think it's a good way to take what I believe is an inevitable step with ISO. I anticipate that in the next revision of ISO, it's not going to be voluntary. It's going to be, do you have a system that you can show that you're considering risk in your operations?
Which I guess would bring up your point then of bringing in junior leaders to get them involved in risk management as well, right?
Yeah, the more people involved in risk management, we talked about transparency, the more understanding there is about how management is dealing with various aspects of their operations. And that's where the optimization comes in, is the more people that understand how decisions are made, the more optimal your lab will run.
Sure. Take another question. Are there any recommended templates or worksheets available for prospective FMEA?
Yes, and that this worksheet that I showed you there, we just got off the internet. The internet's a powerful thing. I would say just Google FMEA worksheets, and there's a variety of different ones, and they're all very simplistic and easy to fill out. So yeah, there's templates available on the internet, quite easily accessible.
Was it a trial by error for your lab till you found one that you were comfortable with, or?
They all kind of say the same thing. It's just we modified it a little bit to accommodate what we were trying to get at, but it's pretty straightforward. You're looking at a specific process, and then you identify what is the failure that you're considering, and you just work it through. It does provide an easy way to follow through the various processes that you want to look at.
Great. Another question. How do you reduce subjectivity for ratings in practice?
No, that's why I kept on emphasizing the semi-quantitative, right? This isn't a perfect system. It has human input into it in terms of what different people feel. The best way to do that is through the use of a cross-functional team, because everybody has kind of a different perspective as to the severity or the occurrence or the detection. So that's the difficult part. You will see some, especially in the manufacturing industry, they have a lot of data that they can count on, and they know that, for example, a failure of a brake line is far more important than a failure on a windshield wiper. So they might change the severity, the number or severity that they're willing to take based on the operation that they're looking at. So it really is trial and error.
Great. Could you explain again the relationship between risk and opportunity?
Okay, so generally, and this is why the definition of uncertainty on objectives is so clear, because uncertainty doesn't talk about positive and negative. So when we think of risk, we have this tendency to think of as a negative construct, but it talks about you meeting your objective. And the easiest way and it's not, maybe the example of strategic planning isn't clear, but that there's an opportunity. And remember, you're controlling for a lack of information. And let's say you're a business that wants to get into a certain field, and there's a risk for you either getting into it or not getting into it. Now, there's no negative aspect about it, so there's an opportunity. So the idea is, if you focus on a lack of knowledge or information, I think it clears up the understanding, and it takes the risk, the kind of a traditional view of risk that we have as a negative construct, and turns it into a more neutral construct. So think of it in terms of a lack of information. What information do I have in order to meet my objectives? And oftentimes it's in the future, and there's an opportunity. There's a lack of information about an opportunity that might be available.
Right. And Nelson, you're obviously coming from a very large laboratory system. Would these same techniques could they be applied to smaller laboratories?
Absolutely. This is not about big or small. This is more conceptually about understanding. And I want to reemphasize the importance of optimizing the management of a lab, whether you're a one-person lab or whether you're a 600-person lab system like I came from. It just makes you think about things that you otherwise wouldn't think about. And if that's the only thing you get from risk-based thinking, that's an advantage that you have over somebody who doesn't incorporate these things. So yes, absolutely.
And Back to bias, another question from the audience. How do you reduce bias in the assessment stage?
The great questions. The best way that I can think of is to have a diverse group of people looking at this, right, from different aspects, which is why it's important. You can't have 10 people because then it gets a little cumbersome. But you could increase that maybe to 5 or even 6 individuals, and you can take the average of those scores. Again, and I want to reemphasize this point, there is some subjectivity that you're never going to eliminate from the process, but it's better than not having a process at all. It's better than not having the information available about what the level of risk is associated with it. And I think the example that I gave, in most labs, we would have closed that car. And then just having that information, even though it's not perfect, makes us think, maybe we should have done something more.
Well, thank you, Nelson. And thank you, everyone, for listening in. Unfortunately, we do not have time for any further questions today, but feel free to reach out to Nelson for any additional information. His contact information will appear shortly in the coming up final slides. And thank you all very much again for attending. And Nelson, thank you again.
No, thank you all. Thank you.
Before you leave today's webinar, please participate in our short 5-minute survey. Simply click the checkbox icon directly above the chat to access the audience feedback survey for today's event. Your feedback is critical information that helps us improve our webinars and continue providing the best experience possible. We would greatly appreciate it. Lastly, across the top of the live stream window are links to our social media profiles, including Twitter, LinkedIn, and Facebook. There is also a link to the FDCOE website, the Just Science podcast, and the FDCOE newsletter registration. Like, follow, or subscribe to stay up to date with everything the FDCOE is doing in support of the forensic community. Thank you again for attending, and we hope everyone has a great day.